Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly through a door that doesn't quite want to open into a house that already knows you're tired before you do. The air feels thick, like it's been holding its breath for decades, and somewhere deep in the floorboards, something creaks, not loudly, just enough to suggest it remembers footsteps that weren't supposed to be heard. You move forward anyway, because curiosity always wins, even when it probably shouldn't. And as you pass through a narrow hallway lined with portraits whose eyes seem just a little too aware, you begin to notice something strange. This place doesn't just contain memories, it keeps them. You probably won't survive this. Not in a dramatic way, no ghost jumping out of wardrobes, but in the quiet, creeping sense that once this house notices you, it won't forget you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into a Victorian parlor, the kind that looks perfectly arranged and deeply uncomfortable at the same time. The curtains are drawn just enough to let in a polite amount of sunlight, because even daylight in this era has manners. Everything feels controlled. Chairs sit upright like they've been trained. Tables hold objects that don't seem meant to be touched, and somewhere in the stillness, you feel it, that low, constant hum of exhaustion. Victorian daily life, especially for women, runs on a strict schedule that leaves very little room for something as rebellious as rest. Mornings begin early, often before the sun fully commits to the sky, filled with duties that range from managing servants to overseeing meals to maintaining a social image that must never crack. A mainstream historical fact, middle and upper-class Victorian women were expected to embody moral virtue and composure at all times, which, as you can imagine, is incredibly tiring when you're not allowed to just flop onto a couch and say, "I need 5 minutes." But here's the strange part. You don't see anyone resting. Not openly, not officially, yet the air feels heavy with it, like fatigue has soaked into the wallpaper itself. You walk further in, and the house responds, not dramatically, just subtly. A floorboard sighs under your weight. A chair gives the faintest creak, like it remembers someone else sitting there, someone who wasn't supposed to. And suddenly, you realize this place isn't just a setting, it's a witness. There's a quiet tension in the room, a sense that people here once lived double lives, not in the scandalous sense, but in the deeply human one. Outwardly composed, inwardly exhausted. Historians still argue whether Victorian women were consciously aware of how overworked they were, or if they simply accepted it as the natural order of things. But standing here, you get the feeling that awareness existed. It just wasn't spoken aloud. And then there's a small detail you might miss if you're not paying attention. A faint indentation on a chaise lounge near the window. Not large, not obvious, but enough to suggest that someone, at some point, lay down here, briefly, quietly, like a secret. A quirky tidbit slips into your mind. Victorian homes were often designed with fainting couches, supposedly for women who felt lightheaded due to tight corsets. But historians debate how much of that fainting was actually physical and how much was strategic. Because if society allows you to faint, it also allows you to lie down. Convenient, right? You move closer to the chaise, and the house seems to lean in with you, as if it's about to tell you something, not in words, but in presence, in memory, in the soft, lingering impression that rest here wasn't laziness, it was survival. And as you stand there in a room that looks perfectly still, but feels quietly alive, you begin to understand. This house doesn't just remember what people did, it remembers what they needed. You linger near that faint indentation on the chaise, and the longer you stand there, the more the room seems to press its quiet story into you. Not loudly, not urgently, just enough that you start to feel it in your shoulders, that slow, creeping heaviness that says, "You're more tired than you thought." You move again, drifting deeper into the house, and everything remains meticulously arranged, like someone paused life mid-performance and never quite resumed it. The hallway opens into another sitting room, slightly smaller, slightly dimmer, and somehow even more suffocating in its politeness. There's a tea set waiting on a small table, untouched but expectant, as if someone was supposed to sit down hours ago and simply didn't. Victorian routines don't really allow for didn't. A typical day for a middle or upper-class woman is less about personal comfort and more about maintaining an image. You're managing correspondence, overseeing household staff, preparing for social visits, possibly practicing piano, not because you want to, but because not playing piano would be suspiciously interesting. A well-run home is a full-time performance, and the audience is always watching, even when no one is physically in the room, especially then. And here's the thing. You're doing all of this while dressed like your organs have signed a formal complaint. Corsets, those iconic symbols of Victorian fashion, aren't just decorative. They reshape your body into something society deems acceptable. A mainstream historical fact, tightly laced corsets could restrict breathing and compress internal organs, sometimes leading to dizziness or fainting. You can almost feel it now, that shallow breath, that slight pressure, like your ribs are negotiating for space they no longer fully own. No wonder that chaise lounge looked so inviting. But it's not just the corset, it's the layers, the long skirts, the petticoats, the expectation that you remain composed no matter how warm, how tired, how quietly desperate your body feels. And all of this is happening in rooms with limited ventilation because open windows might invite dust, or worse, unpredictability. Victorian homes love control more than comfort. You pause near the tea set, noticing how perfectly aligned everything is. Cups angled just so, saucers placed with almost mathematical precision. It's beautiful in a way that makes you slightly nervous, because nothing here suggests spontaneity. Nothing here says, I was too tired to care. And yet, the exhaustion is everywhere. Historians still argue whether Victorian fatigue was primarily physical, from clothing and workload, or psychological, from the constant pressure to perform ideal femininity. Standing here, it feels like both are quietly teaming up against you, like a tag team, but instead of wrestling, they're just making you really, really sleepy. You reach out, not to touch anything, just to steady yourself, and that's when you notice something odd. A shawl draped over the back of a chair, not folded, not displayed, just left there, casually, almost rebelliously. It's such a small thing, but in a house like this, it feels enormous, because leaving something out of place suggests interruption. It suggests that someone, at some point, stopped performing. Maybe just for a moment, maybe because they couldn't continue. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some Victorian advice manuals warned women against overexertion of the nerves, recommending periods of quiet rest in dimly lit rooms, not officially called naps, more like strategic stillness, because calling it a nap might imply you needed rest, and needing rest might imply weakness, and we can't have that. Much better to faint elegantly or recline with purpose. You glance back at the chaise lounge in the other room, remembering that subtle indentation. It doesn't feel accidental anymore. It feels necessary. The house seems to agree. There's a softness in the air now, like it's easing you into something. Not sleep exactly, but the idea of it, the permission of it, the quiet understanding that behind every perfectly arranged room, there were moments where someone simply couldn't keep going, and maybe didn't. You take a slow breath, well, as slow as a corset would allow, which is to say, not very, and realize that this isn't just a story about strict schedules or elaborate clothing. It's about what happens when human bodies meet inhuman expectations. Something has to give. And in this house, it seems, what gave was time itself. Just a few stolen minutes here and there, tucked between duties, hidden beneath shawls, disguised as delicacy. You don't see anyone lying down, but you're starting to feel exactly where they did.
You don't remember deciding to sit, but suddenly you're closer to the floor, closer to the furniture, as if the house itself has gently lowered you into its rhythm. The air feels softer here, heavier in a comforting way, like a thick blanket you didn't know you needed. And as your gaze drifts across the room, you begin to notice something subtle but unmistakable. This space wasn't just lived in, it was quietly negotiated with, because no one here was officially allowed to rest. Not really. And yet, they did. You move toward a slightly angled chair near the window, its position just imperfect enough to suggest intention. It's not facing the center of the room like the others. It's turned slightly away, angled toward a patch of filtered light. Not enough to draw attention, just enough to feel private. You can almost picture it now. Someone sitting there, posture perfect at first, hands folded neatly in their lap, and then, slowly, almost invisibly, loosening. A breath held too long finally released. A head tilting back just a fraction. Eyes closing. Not in sleep, of course not, but in reflection. Victorian society had a remarkable talent for renaming things so they felt acceptable. You don't nap, you recline. You don't rest, you recover. You're not exhausted, you're delicate. It's like the world's most polite rebranding campaign, and honestly, it works surprisingly well. A mainstream historical fact slips gently into place. By the mid-19th century, the idea of the afternoon lie-down had begun to appear in domestic routines, especially among women who were considered prone to nervous fatigue. It wasn't officially labeled as sleep, but the intention was clear. Step away, lie down, and restore yourself just enough to continue performing the day. But here's where it gets interesting. Historians still argue whether these moments were socially constructed allowances, tiny cracks in a rigid system, or if they emerged organically, simply because human bodies refused to cooperate with endless expectation. Standing here, or rather, gently leaning now because standing feels like a bit too much effort, you get the sense it's both. A quiet rebellion, wrapped in acceptable language. You notice a small footstool tucked beside the chair. Again, not perfectly aligned, just enough to suggest it was moved, used, needed. And beside it, that same soft shawl from earlier, except now it feels different, less like a misplaced object, more like a tool, a very elegant tool for disappearing. A quirky detail surfaces, almost like the house whispering it to you. In some Victorian households, women were encouraged to retreat to dim rooms during the afternoon to avoid overstimulation of the nerves. Curtains drawn, voices hushed, movement minimized. It sounds suspiciously like the world's earliest version of Do Not Disturb. You can't help but smile a little at that. Imagine needing a medical excuse just to take a nap. Sorry, can't socialize right now. My nerves require immediate horizontal positioning. Honestly, it's not the worst strategy. You lower yourself into the chair, carefully, quietly, and the moment you do, the room seems to settle around you, not in a dramatic way, just approvingly, like you followed instructions that were never spoken out loud. And then you feel it, that pull. Not sleep exactly, but the edge of it, that soft, drifting sensation where your thoughts begin to loosen, where the weight of expectation slips just slightly off your shoulders. You can almost hear the faint echoes of others who sat here before you, women who mastered the art of resting without being seen resting, because that was the trick, wasn't it? Not to stop, but to pause so gently that no one could accuse you of it. You imagine one of them now. She sits where you sit, her posture impeccable even in stillness, her eyes closed for just a moment longer than necessary. The house watches, remembers, protects. A door remains slightly ajar, just in case. A servant passes quietly, choosing not to notice. There's a kind of unspoken agreement here. We will pretend this isn't happening, and in return, you may continue. Historians still argue whether these micro moments of rest had any measurable impact on health or well-being, or if they were simply symbolic gestures in a system that demanded too much. But as you sit here, feeling your own thoughts slow and stretch, it's hard to believe they meant nothing. Even a few minutes can feel like everything. The light shifts slightly through the curtains, softer now, more golden. Time is moving, but differently, less like a ticking clock, more like a gentle tide. You begin to understand that this wasn't about laziness or indulgence. It was about survival. Quiet, careful, socially acceptable survival. And the house, this patient, watchful house, held space for it all. Every stolen minute, every disguised vase, every moment where someone chose themselves, just briefly, in a world that rarely allowed it. You don't fall asleep, but you come very, very close.
You don't quite notice when you stand again, only that the room seems to release you slowly, like it knows you'll be back, or at least someone like you will. The quiet lingers in your limbs as you move forward, drifting into a wider corridor where the air shifts just slightly. It feels less contained here, less intimate, as if the house is opening a window not just to the outside world, but to time itself. Because beyond these walls, everything is speeding up. You pause near a tall window, its glass faintly rippled, and look out, not at a clear scene, but at an impression of movement. Carriages passing, people walking with purpose, smoke rising in the distance, the unmistakable hum of the Industrial Revolution reshaping everything it touches. A mainstream historical fact settles in. By the 19th century, industrialization had begun to impose strict, clock-based schedules on daily life, replacing older, more fluid rhythms tied to daylight and season. Time, suddenly, is no longer something you feel. It's something you obey. And inside this house, that pressure seeps in, even if it pretends not to. You can sense it in the way rooms are arranged, in the expectation that every hour has a purpose: morning duties, midday visits, afternoon correspondence, evening appearances. It's like living inside a very polite machine, one that doesn't make noise but still expects you to keep up. The problem is, your body didn't get the memo. You lean slightly against the wall, feeling that familiar heaviness return, and it makes sense now in a different way. These quiet moments of rest you've been noticing, they aren't just personal choices, they're responses, adjustments, small acts of balance in a world that's tilting too fast. Historians still argue whether the rise of structured time directly increased the need for daytime rest, or if people simply became more aware of their fatigue once everything was measured and scheduled. But standing here, watching the blurred motion beyond the glass, it feels inevitable. When life becomes rigid, the body looks for softness wherever it can find it. And sometimes it finds it in secret. You move away from the window and into a slightly cooler room, where the light is dimmer and the atmosphere feels quieter in a deliberate way. This isn't just a sitting room, it's something else, a space designed not for display, but for retreat. There's a narrow bed along the wall, simple, almost understated compared to the rest of the house. Not quite a bedroom, not quite a public space, something in between. And that in-between feeling is important, because this is where medicine enters the story. A quirky but very real detail. During the Victorian era, physicians often diagnosed women with conditions like neurasthenia or nervous exhaustion, recommending extended periods of rest as treatment. The famous rest cure, popularized later in the century, sometimes required patients to lie down for hours, even days, with minimal stimulation. It sounds intense, and honestly a little like being told to do nothing professionally, which, depending on your personality, is either a dream or a nightmare. You step closer to the narrow bed, noticing how carefully it's arranged. Not stiff like the parlor furniture, but not entirely relaxed either. It's prepared, anticipatory, like it's waiting for someone who's been told, officially this time, that rest is not just allowed, but required. And that changes everything, because when rest becomes medical, it becomes respectable. No longer a hidden indulgence or a quiet rebellion, it's now something you can do without apology. You're not napping, you're recovering, you're following doctor's orders, you're participating in your own well-being, which sounds very modern, but here it comes with a very specific tone of seriousness. Historians still argue whether these medical prescriptions genuinely improved health or reinforced existing social limitations, keeping women confined under the guise of care. And standing here, you can feel both possibilities lingering in the air, relief and restriction side by side. You imagine someone lying on this bed, eyes closed, not in secrecy, but in compliance. The house watches differently here, not as a keeper of secrets, but as a witness to something sanctioned, approved, documented even. And yet, the feeling is familiar. That same softness, that same quiet drift at the age of awareness. Because whether it's hidden behind a shawl in a parlor or prescribed in a dim room by a physician, the core need remains unchanged. The body asks for pause, for stillness, for a moment where the world stops asking things of it. And the house, always listening, always remembering, holds that moment carefully. You exhale slowly, realizing that what began as a secret has now found a kind of legitimacy. Not fully free, not entirely understood, but no longer completely hidden either. Rest is making its way into the daylight, just gently.
You don't rush as you leave that dim, sanctioned room. The air seems to follow you, softer now, as though the house itself has relaxed just a little in your presence. Or maybe you've finally adjusted to its quiet language. Either way, something has shifted. What once felt like hidden defiance now feels almost woven into the structure of daily life. You pass again through the corridor, but this time you notice details you missed before. A slightly open window, a chair angled toward a breeze, curtains that aren't fully drawn, just enough to let warmth slip through. These aren't accidents, they're adaptations. And as you move, the house seems to stretch outward, not physically, but historically. Its walls begin to echo with places far beyond this quiet Victorian setting. Heat rises in your imagination, bright, relentless sunlight, the kind that makes movement feel optional at best. A mainstream historical fact settles in gently. Across many parts of the world, particularly in Mediterranean and colonial regions, midday rest had long been a practical response to climate. In hotter environments, people paused work during peak afternoon heat, resuming later when temperatures dropped. It wasn't indulgence, it was efficiency. And somehow that idea begins to seep into this house. You pause near another window, this one open just enough to let in a faint, warm current of air. It feels different from the stillness you've known so far, less controlled, more forgiving. You can almost sense the influence of distant places carried back through travel, trade, and empire. A quirky tidbit drifts into your awareness. British colonials stationed in places like India often adopted local customs, including midday rest periods, simply because the heat made constant activity unbearable. And when they returned home, they didn't always leave those habits behind. Some brought them back, reframed them, softened them into something that could fit within Victorian expectations. Because everything here has to fit, even rest. Historians still argue whether these afternoon lie-downs were ever fully accepted, or if they always remained slightly hidden beneath layers of etiquette and explanation. But here, in this quiet space, it doesn't seem to matter, because the house accepted them. It held them. It kept them safe. And now it offers that same quiet permission to you. Your eyes grow heavier, not suddenly, not overwhelmingly, just gently, like the closing of a long day. The kind of tired that doesn't demand attention, only acknowledgement. And as you sit there in a house that has seen centuries of quiet exhaustion and softer recoveries, you begin to feel something unexpected. Not just sleep, but understanding. That rest was never laziness. It was always memory in the making. The room dims slowly, though you're not sure if it's the light fading or your eyes closing. The edges of things soften first. the sharp lines of furniture, the quiet symmetry of the walls, until everything feels a little more distant, a little more dreamlike. You're still here, still aware, but only just. The house breathes around you in that same patient rhythm, as if it's syncing gently with your own. There's nothing left to do now. No duties waiting behind a door, no expectations pressing from the hallway. Just this small, quiet space where time loosens its grip and lets you drift. You notice you're breathing slow, each inhale softer than the last, each exhale carrying away a little more weight you didn't realize you were holding. And the chaise lounge beneath you feels warmer, more familiar, as though it's been waiting, not just for someone, but for this exact moment. And maybe it has. Maybe every room in this house has been holding on to these fragments of rest, passing them forward one quiet afternoon at a time. Your thoughts begin to wander, not in sharp directions, but in soft loops. A shawl on a chair, a curtain half drawn, the faint echo of footsteps choosing not to interrupt, all of it blending together into something calm, something steady, something safe. And as you drift closer to sleep, the house doesn't watch anymore. It simply remembers.